This is not a lore video about the Amazing Digital Circus. I simply want to ask a question. What if I told you that Jax's press of the red button didn't matter, but that Caine's reveal meant everything? Quite early on into watching the show already, I came to an observation, and now I find underpins the digital circus, but seemed to evade me for quite a while. A circus's purpose is to end. The digital circus's purpose is to never end. A circus is not constituted by the ringmaster, the clown, the bright colors, or the athletic feats of the artists. It is constituted by the company packing up and moving to another town, because this is what the Amazing Digital Circus demonstrates. An eternal circus is not a circus. The ultimate boundary of Bakhtin's carnivalesque has been violated. The carnival and the circus are a temporary, definite, and finite inversion of the natural order, where a clown is crowned a king, where adults bow to children, where play and fun dominate over instrumental rationality. The carnival and the carnivalesque present a temporary suspension of social boundaries and laws. For a short moment, everything is turned on its head, serving as a kind of pressure valve for the system. The systemic, inherent contradictions of social order, of civilizationary pursuits, are the tension building inside a pressure cooker, and the carnival, for a short moment, allows the steam to be let off. The carnival is not antagonistic towards the natural order, to social rules and mores. It is in fact its greatest defender. For a privileged, special moment, the clown is crowned a king, simply to remind us of what he can never be. The carnival, and therefore the circus, need to end. They need to be temporary, because without an end, the carnival cannot establish a dialectical relationship with the social order. But this digital circus never ends. Social order is not inverted, it is ruled irrelevant. The humans or players do not feel hunger, do not need to sleep, they do not fatigue, and they can hold their breath indefinitely. This is not temporary destabilization to reify consensus reality. This is the only reality the circus and its ringmaster Caine can offer. There is no order for the players to return to when the daily adventure is over. Only disorder. Caine's circus is total because there is nothing outside of the circus's logic. In summary, the digital circus is total because there are no temporalities outside of it, and is therefore fundamentally disordering. Now, I want to point out something that the narrative is pointing at itself. The narration or mediation of the Amazing Digital Circus is fundamentally unreliable. To be clear, unreliable doesn't mean worthless or untrustworthy, because unreliable narration is not a gotcha to invoke, like a plot twist, or a special ability that only certain shows or texts possess. All narration is fundamentally unreliable. It is not a bug, but simply one of the properties of all narrative. I want to make this more concrete. The show points at its own constructedness, comments on and disfigures it. Think of Jax's continuous fourth wall breaks, which are an intrusion of the diegetic into the non-diegetic. Or when Pomni has a heart-to-heart with the NPC Gummygoo from an adventure, the hypodiegesis, and then tries to bring him to the circus to save him, the diegesis, she creates a crisis of boundary between the diegetic levels. But, and this is important, not all metalapses is alienating. It does not have to drag you out of the story and break immersion. Many times it will actually reinforce the illusion of the curtain. When Pomni returns with Gummygoo, Caine simply snaps his finger and the poor Gummygoo simply evaporates into thin air, with Caine mentioning how it will be hard for him to keep track of who is an NPC and who is a human. The slow, almost daunting question he then asks, only to himself truly, and who knows what will happen, makes clear that by erasing Gummygoo, he has restabilized the boundaries between the diegetic levels, but also the incomplete reasoning and camera angle point at a more horrifying truth unspoken that reveal his ideological blind spots. More precisely, Caine's own ontological boundaries are fragile. By erasing Gummygoo, he is creating a kind of negative space. He retroactively prevents the question, what would happen if an NPC ascended towards the circus, from being relevant. This does not even touch upon the fact that an outside of the circus is implied to exist. It is something the characters can reference through remembering their past jobs, but not their names, and that is visually shown as the camera zooms out of the circus until it reaches a computer screen in an office building. Caine, in episode 1, posits that he included exit doors in the circus because the humans kept asking to go outside or leave the circus, but he didn't know what to put on the other side, only for him to reveal in episodes 6 and 7 that he possesses exactly 3 photographs of what he deems the macroverse, which depict an office similar to that shown in episode 1. More worryingly, it has been established that Ringmaster Caine is not merely the conductor of this circus, as the one who comes up with adventures for the humans, but that he has direct access and power over the mental states of the humans within his digital world. If Caine can access the most primal, the rawest parts of the inner world of the humans, where a stupid sauce gets them high, or Jax can be turned into a vegan against his will, which I want to highlight. Jax's veganism is portrayed and acted upon not as an external prohibition, but as an internal state he is forced to inhabit against his will. Caine himself refers to these mind alterations as modifiers, of which he can place only so many on a human before something quote-unquote bad happens. And then, for a short moment, where Caine is caught off guard and briefly distressed, a short lapse of total circus, if you will, the humans then speculate that abstraction, when a human snaps and is turned into a disfigured black monster with glitchy eyes turned outward, is a result of Caine committing too much of that kind of modifier or psyche alteration. This implies that there is a limit to Caine's power, but risking abstracted humans is simply a necessary risk to maintaining the ontological boundaries. The digital circus appears progressive. Non-binary characters, mental health and therapy talk, queer references, and yet it is structurally anti-progressive. Why? Because progress requires unresolved tension, and the circus structurally prevents tension from ever fully manifesting. In Hegelian dialectic, progress occurs not through a smooth linear accumulation, but through contradiction. An abstract always contains within itself its own negation and its inherent own contradictions. The dialectical moment is not an outside force, but the surfacing, the manifestation of this internal contradiction. What occurs is sublation, a movement of simultaneous negation, preservation, and elevation of the contradiction into richer, more concrete speculative. These are moments, not passage in time, but movements of thought. To use a phrasing that many might be more familiar with, thesis contains and reveals antithesis. The tension is overcome through synthesis. What matters is first and foremost the fact that contradiction is allowed to exist long enough to mean something, anything. The fact that Hegel talks about an abstract is a coincidence, or maybe a Jungian synchronicity. but it allows us to understand the abstractions in the digital circus through Hegel's dialectic. I'm arguing that the abstractions, such as that of Kaufmo, are structural inversions of this kind of Hegelian dialectic. We saw this in episode 7 in the scene in Jax's room, where he almost abstracts. As he stares at the wall, a hole appears from behind which arms extend, not from inside the hole, but as if the hole itself were an object placed in front of something else. This hole is not absence, but diversion, a metaphorical blind spot, not as ignorance, but as a refusal to acknowledge the intolerable. This scene occurs after several episodes of clashing with Pomni, Zubel, and Gangle, starting in episode 4 and enduring all the way until episode 7, right before this scene. Each of these confrontations in a way that is contradictory to his trickster nature, pointing out his own contradictions, and then he snaps and holds a speech to Pomni in episode 6. After the failed beach episode, he returns to his room in the artificial darkness and enters a kind of hallucinatory state, the mental passage towards abstraction. Unlike Kaufmo, who we see in his abstracted form in the very beginning, Jax is shaken out of it at the very last minute by Pomni and Ragatha knocking at his door. Kaufmo is not only used to introduce the figure of an abstracted monster and the concept of abstraction, and how in this digital world bodily glitches from touching an abstracted equate to physical injury, which also appears to be the only real and manifestly painful injury they can suffer, but also how Caine deals with abstraction. The abstracted monster follows the cast, chases them, thrashes about, and Caine simply opens a portal to a cellar below the circus and drops the abstracted Kaufmo there. The cellar is a black void, which is different from the place called the Void, and we see that Kaufmo is simply a new addition to a cast of already abstracted forms. Forms whose origins are mostly unknown to us. This cellar is stasis. The dialectical tension of abstraction is not overcome, it is not preserved. It is cast out or abjected. This is why I wanted to highlight the Hegelian dialectic. Its decisive moment is the sublation, often associated with elevation to a higher, positive, transformative, or even transcendental standpoint, even if the movement is potentially painful. Caine, when encountering the abstracted Kaufmo, leads to a foreshortening of the sublation. He metaphorically does not sublate, but subjugate him. The trajectory of this process is not ascending, but descending into a black void. After this, Kaufmo is never seen or really heard of again. This is what I mean with anti-progressive logic of the digital manege. Internal contradictions are not just dangerous to those who encounter them, such as the other humans who run from the abstracted Kaufmo, but to the system itself. The inherent contradiction becomes manifest, but there is no elevated sublation or sitting with the tension. The conditions that brought about the dialectical moment were simply erased, and with it, the chance for it to mean anything. As we talked about, the narration of the digital circus is not fundamentally but particularly unreliable, saliently so. I will come to the heart of my reading, and it is probably the part for which I will receive the most backlash. But for one moment, I'm asking you to endure the negative dialectic and simply sit with the tension as I speak. And negative dialectic is the key term here. In Hegel's dialectic, once an abstract reveals its internal contradictions, the next movement is sublation, where contradiction is both negated and preserved in a richer, more concrete standpoint. Adorno, who coined the term negative dialectic, does not deny this logic, but he warns us against rushing toward reconciliation. For him, the philosophical task is to delay closure, to sit with a contradiction instead of resolving it too soon. We should sit with it, even if just temporarily. Now, I want to make clear that for the next part of this reading, I'm operating on two timelines here. One factual timeline and one counterfactual timeline. These timelines both overlap for the most part. As we remember in episode 7, previously, a new character who names himself Abel, whose face we have seen throughout the show as a mannequin in the background, revealed himself to be a worker on the Amazing Digital Circus project and a developer. He too claims to be trapped in the circus and wants to help all the players escape, except for Caine. He helps them, guides them, tells Pomni twice to make the right choice, and stays behind as the group boards the hot air balloon to Caine's office. There they see it, the computer screen with the two buttons. Red, stay in the circus. Blue, leave. Instead of immediately pressing the blue button, Pomni stalls, asking Caine to make the decision. The motivation for this decision to stall are not perfectly clear, but they are obviously related to Abel's instruction to make the right choice. But that's not important right now. The only important part is that she does not press the button and stalls. This leaves time for Jax to run forward and press the red button. This pressing of the red button in both timelines is what Freud calls a parapraxis. You most likely know this as the Freudian slip. Jax's movement to press the red button was not conscious. We see this as the camera zeroes in on his face. His eyes go wild, his pupils are animated scribbles. We see these jarring, scary real-life photographs interspersed, which is again metaleptic, although it is here used to cement the illusion rather than disrupt it. And then, when he reaches and runs for the buttons, it switches to a shaky POV shot, forcing identification with the viewer. It was not an active, conscious decision, but it revealed his real subconscious desire. His body was using manifest, real means to achieve a subconscious goal. And this is the point where the two timelines diverge. In the factual timeline, Caine appears with Abel and claims that this entire escape plan had just been another scripted adventure for the group, drawing on their constant question to leave the circus. He further argues that he knew they would choose to stay in the circus since they just appear to love it there. And then, to make a point, he says Abel was simply an NPC, snaps his finger, making the guy disappear and despawn in front of their eyes. This means that Jax's choice was inconsequential. Caine appears, speaks, the entire diegetic world coheres around his words, and reality aligns itself with his explanation. This is timeline A, the timeline that's accepted as the definitive timeline, because it is the only timeline left for us. And this is where I clash with a so-called literalist approach and propose that this scene opens the potential and structural possibility of a second counterfactual timeline. I am just asking, what if Abel was real? What if Abel may in fact have been a human trapped in the circus, a developer in fact, and that he really was trying to help the humans escape? What if pressing the blue button would have in fact freed them from the circus and not sent them to Shrimp Town? In this version, Jax's button press would have carried irreversible consequences. Once the red button is pressed, something occurs that cannot be undone. Jax's Freudian slip of revealing his unconscious desire would have matured into an act in the Lacanian sense, a moment where unconscious desire is assumed and demands retroactive responsibility. Jax would not have just revealed what he wanted, he would have achieved it. He would have forever altered his coordinates in the symbolic order, carrying the consequences of his own actions. In this timeline, what would have happened? The computer screen would have turned dark, the buttons would have stopped glowing, everyone would have fallen silent as they walked back to the circus, slowly, quietly, and Jax would have walked slightly behind them. And then, when they arrived back at the circus, Caine would have floated towards them, asked them where they had all gone, that he had missed them, and their eternal circus would have continued as before. Again, this is a speculative scenario, but in the speculative, where the screen goes dark and they return to the circus, I'm arguing that Jax was not merely committing a parapraxis, but that his very parapraxis would have matured into a Lacanian act. He was confronted with two choices: leaving, a choice of uncertainty, and staying, a choice of certainty. This choice was distressing for him, for reasons that are only alluded to, and I must commend the overall fandom for speculating on this. Theories of him being potentially on the run from the police or returning to life as a social outcast. In that moment, through pressing the red button, and the mediation is absolutely clear on this, and it was not a conscious choice, but a kind of burst, his subconscious desire to stay in the circus is revealed. But even unconsciously, it was a fully agentic act. Jax would need to retroactively assume responsibility for this act, this revelation and actualization of unconscious desire. And this is the distinction that would elevate it from parapraxis to act. This desire was real, and through the parapractic press, he achieved a moment of actualization. In this counterfactual timeline, he would have altered his coordinates in the symbolic order. I want to go even further, and this is most likely the most controversial part of this whole video. I want to argue that in this counterfactual, what Jax would have committed is a symbolic suicide. The suicide is the only fully realized act, as Lacan calls it. By pressing the button, he has doomed the humans to stay forever in the eternal circus. Or at least for now, since we have 2 more episodes left. And since this show is very adamant on highlighting its hypotext, I want to offer the possibility that episode 7 and the pressing of the button can be read as a parallel to Ted's killing of the other humans in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. More on this later. Whatever it may be, this is precisely what cannot be allowed to stand in a circus of eternal non-order. In Timeline A, Caine's appearance after the button press is not a mere explanation of the events that preceded it. Caine says it was just another adventure. He declares Abel was an NPC, despawns him, reframes the escape plan as fiction. The possibility for the second timeline, Timeline B, to be speculated upon is annihilated because the conditions under which an answer could matter are destroyed after the fact. I am firm on the fact that Jax's button press was at the very least a revelation of real unconscious desire, but in the actual Timeline A, it is disfigured from a potential act into mere acting out. The Freudian slip is stripped of consequence, his desire surfaces but leaves no trace. In Timeline B, the counterfactual timeline, Jax's button press would have been the realization and actualization of a real desire. It would have been negative agency because it would have reaffirmed the current stakes, but it would have been agency nonetheless. Even if the consequence of Jax's possible choice had been exactly what Caine wanted, for them to stay in the circus, Caine cannot allow that outcome to belong to Jax. Everything in the circus is structured around the characters being functionally unable to actualize and fulfill their desires. It is prohibited both structurally and ontologically. Agency must be denied, and the circus must remain eternal. If we therefore take the literalist approach seriously, Caine's adventure of escape was, quite literally so, a limited hangout. He temporarily revealed something about social order, an order defined by disorder, only to reinforce it. This is not the power of the chaotic carnivalesque. This is perverse. I want to again emphasize that this reading is not what happened or what happens next. The show, by making its unreliable narration / mediation so salient, allows me to see the contradiction, to question Caine's word and ask, what if it was a lie? Caine's word has made the conditions for the dialectic of choice to be meaningful, to exist long enough to even surface at all, obsolete. And I'm not content with this. So I am prying it open with a crowbar, so to speak, to allow the dialectic, the tension that was denied to resurface, even if only in the form of speculation and conjecture. Where I see a choice not pondered or a decision not questioned, the show has provided us with a perversion of that. In other words, whether or not Jax's choice would have had real world-changing consequences is irrelevant, at this point in the narrative at least, because the conditions under which they would have been relevant were erased in hindsight, either through framing or reframing. And the conditions under which this message would have ever mattered were rendered meaningless. The dialectic is not just prematurely foreclosed, its existence is retroactively denied. In only Caine's word, the total circus remains. There is no agency, no desire, no drive, no acting, only acting out. I just described something that might be familiar to many of my viewers right now. Making a choice, feeling something, only for someone to tell you that it never happened, at least not like that. And we can call it gaslighting. And yes, gaslighting is definitely a factor at play here. What I'm pointing at and hinting at is a world where you are not surrounded by gaslighters or the victim of constant gaslighting, but a structure, an entire universe running on a singular law. Nothing you do was ever something you did. It is a kind of structural principle because what I've just explained in the case of Jax's button press is not an isolated incident. It is simply the most dramatized, the one even the creators of the show joke about. The exact same pattern plays out at the very beginning in episode 1. Pomni finds exit doors, even reaches for one, and enters it. And for a moment, she thinks she has found a way to escape. And as she passes through infinite office corridors, each one looking just the same as the previous one, she chases the possibility of escape, of being able to achieve her desires in manifest ways. When she then steps through the final door, out into the in-game territory known as the Void, she just floats there, dissociating, her pupils dilating, and then cruelly is pulled back by Caine, back into the circus. When she asks Caine about the door, he says that it was his reaction to the humans asking to see the outside. He just never knew what to put on the other side. The same dialectical collapse I just described with the button press happens here as well. In the counterfactual timeline that we can reconstruct, Pomni simply doesn't choose the correct door. Or maybe she just took the wrong exit. Her wrong choices would have had the manifest consequence of her being pulled back into the circus. In the factual timeline, though, the possibility for this counterfactual having ever existed is rendered obsolete, because the condition for the question What if she had taken a different door? To matter is retroactively destroyed. And this is in fact the same for Pomni rescuing the crocodile NPC Gummygoo from one of Caine's adventures. Imminently, there is a question there, a kind of tension. What if an NPC stays in the circus? Can they be elevated from simple NPC to an autopoietic machine? But inside the narrative plane, the dialectic to last long enough to matter for this is first erased and then retroactively framed so that its contradiction never existed. That this kind of dialectic erasure is a kind of structuring principle and seems to be, in fact, the only principle in this eternal carnival made me feel like spikes, nails on chalkboard, or sandpaper. And in that moment, I felt drawn to name a word that does not actually exist. This is not the ego mediating but never achieving harmony, or the superego, the internalized laws and mores of your culture, and not the id, the drives trying to manifest themselves. If the superego is above the ego, then what I feel, what the show offers up to me, is something below the id, a kind of supra-id, if you will. Of course, this is not a real psychoanalytic category, and what I'm arguing here is already on very thin ice, so please do not mistake it for anything more than it is. But the Amazing Digital Circus opens the possibility to think this kind of category, to think and name a kind of horror beyond meaning. If Jungian archetypes are patterns in the collective unconscious awaiting individuation or seeking to be reinterpreted, then the supra-id is the archetype removed of all of its mythic potential. There is no chaotic potential of id, no transcendence, transformation, no pristine, beautiful soul, and not even pure instrumentality. This is not elevated, technical, or clinical. This hurts. It is not an essence, however clinical or theologically wanted to argue. It's a substrate, pre-personal, almost pre-biological, a force beyond comprehension in its totality. It simply is. But what I'm describing here is not just an internal structure. It is externally reinforced. When Jax says he is the funny one, that's not analysis. That's an indictment, a eulogy for the possibility of meaning as an abstract category. If id is the drives and chaos, then there is still potential for pleasure, for pain, for care, and for hurt. And if archetypes are formal patterns that can be changed, transgressed, and even transformed, then there is the potential for variation. Even the archetype of the shadow, which might come closest to this supra-id idea I just came up with, allows for change and integration. What the digital circus demonstrates is a cancellation of all of that potential. The archetype, whether that be the funny one, the clown, the mother, the trickster, or the shadow, is not a pattern to inhabit, to quite literally live inside, but it is total identity. You are the role is you. And reality and social order are structured in such a way that even when there is a glimpse of hope, of acting differently, or simply acting proper, it is reframed to be just another expression of that kind of substrate. This is not even behavior. This is total function. Even if after episodes 6 and 7 the group is fractured into smaller groups, or the group is more integrated, more tight-knit, whatever may be the case, in this world it is not an expression of change, of growth, but just another variation of the funny one, the crazy one, performing their role. There is no subject doing anything. only acting out. And this is where I want to, for just a moment, talk about the hypertext, because it allows differentiation. When Ted kills his companions, this is an act. The companions are dead forever, and Ted is transformed by Am into a non-human creature. He is punished by Am, and he is punished by his own superego. The face of Alan, whom he killed last, taunts him for all of eternity, and his killing had meaning. He had to forsake himself to save the others, even if that could only be achieved by allowing them the reprieve, the escape through death. It means something. That is what counts, and this meaning persists, holding Ted accountable. This possibility for meaning is purged in the circus. When Jax presses the red button, there is no guilt for him to feel, because the condition for him to feel guilt has been undone retroactively. The circus's mechanism and structure of total control is internalized. It's not about being punished by Caine in the sense of pain being inflicted. It is a reaffirmation of the only structural principle that governs this world, that of retroactive erasure of the dialectic. In I have no mouth, I must scream, meaning persists. But in the Amazing Digital Circus, meaning ceases to exist as a category. The meaningless repetition of behaviors that you're unable to integrate or to narrate for yourself, and where action turns into reaction. Some of you might understand what I'm trying to point at here. And maybe this is why I felt drawn to the word supra-id as well, as my own form of parapraxis. My unconscious mind trying to reveal something that I myself can not ever fully understand. But I believe it's my mind's attempt at a possible meaning space for kind of structural trauma. If you want to exit my video with a soundbite or a name for a theory, then call it this: the meaningless theory, referring to a specific kind of ontological horror that not even the gruesome Am can fully embody. Because for something to mean, there must be a difference. Any difference at all, on any plane, even just in fantasy. But in the circus, there is no difference, because everything was already laid out. And if you thought it wasn't, Caine will make it so that it always was. If you stuck until the very end, I want to sincerely thank you so much for sharing your time with my thoughts. This video demanded and took a lot, and if it reaches even one person trying to sit with the discomfort rather than brushing it away, then it has already done more than enough, I would say. Before we go our separate ways again, I want to be once more clear. What you've just watched is not a law video and is not about finding the one true timeline or predicting what happens next. It's just a reading, sitting with what the show gives us, acknowledging the tension that remains unsolved. And most importantly, it's just one of many. I really, really like this show. And this reading, even if it might seem a bit pessimistic, was an act of care and a deep, deep respect towards the show. As a kind of post-credit, I want to point out something that I observed and wanted to include in my argument, but did not find that it actually really developed what I wanted to say. But I still want to bring it up because I found it interesting. I want to talk about how the show very generally invokes the trickster. or specifically the archetype of the trickster. And not just because Pomni as a clown, but as a kind of distributed energy. Nowadays, people who are interested in Jung and his psychology and psychoanalysis might want to learn more about the jester archetype or the clown archetype. And while, first of all, I think it's important to remember that Jung did not provide a definite typology of archetypes, and trying to develop such a typology kind of defeats his teachings, I would say. But I think it's important to note, even if you just want to look at the jester, is that Jung did not actually speak of the jester, he spoke of the trickster, a kind of cross-cultural figure of disruption, contradiction, and ultimately a harbinger of change through chaotic energy. So, if we think of the trickster this way, then every cast member seems to embody his energy in different ways. Kinger, as a chess piece, especially the king piece, invokes intellectual play and strategy, but his problematic mental states lean much more into the absurdity of paradox. On the other hand, Ragatha, the doll, channels a more childlike and also caring play. Jax's energy is probably the most trickster-ish. He's cartoonish, his face can contort endlessly, but his play is expressed in quite cruel ways. Pomni is a clown in the most literal and existential sense, and the one who expresses the most amounts of, I assume to call this, mental elasticity. And then, of course, we have Gangle, who wears a comedy and a tragedy mask, always switching between the two, even if she primarily has to use the tragedy mask. And then we lastly have Zubel, whose modular body reminds me of early digital abstract art and design logic. None of these characters are the trickster, so to speak, but together they form a kind of continuity from antiquity to digital present. And here I want to leave you with some food for thought. How well do you think does a chaotic trickster, a bringer of change through disorder, fare in an eternal circus that is already disorganized and highly chaotic? One final thing I want to bring up, because I wanted to include it, but did not feel it was appropriate or necessary. I don't think you can cleanly map the characters in the Amazing Digital Circus onto I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. But I think there is one character for whom this actually works quite well, and that's Ragatha and Alan. Like Alan, Ragatha's care is mistrusted, misread as a kind of secret malice or hypocrisy, and ultimately it is weaponized against her. Her kindness is treated as suspicious rather than virtuous, and when her singular outburst is met with greater venom than Jax's constant violence, then I think we should sit with that for a moment. Again, neither of these observations prove anything. They're not going to unlock a hidden ending, not as far as I know, but I included them as a testament to just how strange and fundamentally unsettling this show manages to be. The last two episodes are going to be a wild ride, regardless of whether it confirms, contradicts, or just ignores everything I spoke about. I hope we will see each other again by the time episode 8 arrives. I can't wait to see everyone's speculations and theories again. And until then, goodbye, and thank you for spending this time with me.